Supply Chains for the Digital Economy, Managing Social and Neighbor Impacts. I'm Champa Patel. I'm the head of the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House. And today we're joined by Pamela Ma, who's the Director for Sustainability at the Fung Group and the Executive Vice President, Supply Chain Futures Fung Academy. Thanks for joining us today, Pamela.
Delighted to be here.
So what Pamela is going to be doing today is focusing on how the labor-intensive supply chains, which is now we've seen as a primary driver of poverty alleviation in developing economies, can upgrade to meet the demands of an increasingly digital economy. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Pamela now to speak for 15 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions. What you'll see in the corner of your screen is a chat box. Please do feel free to post any questions there, and we'll be able to bring them in over the course of the webinar. So over to you, Pamela.
Thank you, Champa. Delighted to be here today. Basically, the subject today is how revolutions in retail are driving changes in the supply chain, which are driving automation and then eventually social impacts. Just a bit about the Fung Group. It is a privately held entity headquartered in Hong Kong that basically runs supply chains that span the entire supply chain, servicing global brands and retailers. 4 listed companies on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, including Li & Fung Limited, which is the world's largest sourcing company in consumer products, Fung Retailing, Global Brands Group, and a new entity called LH Pegasus, which is essentially about beauty, fashion, and furniture. So without further ado, basically the story of the revolution in the supply chain is actually driven by the revolution in retail, because supply chains exist to serve the retail industry. And as we've seen, especially in developed markets like the US and Europe, technology has really revolutionized the way that retail operates, both in terms of e-commerce and in terms of consumer empowerment. First, on e-commerce, basically in the United States and Europe, the amount of retail sales accounted for by e-commerce has been rising really steadily, while a lot of brick and mortar high street stores are actually in really dire straits. In the United States, it's about 10% or a bit lower e-commerce as a total proportion of retail sales, but it's growing much faster than brick and mortar. The consequence of this is that as retailers are driven and must serve e-commerce markets, they actually need to operate a lot faster. They need to be a lot more transparent. There's a lot more price competition, and the overall cycle from design and to delivery is actually shrunk. And as well, quantities are actually a lot less than in the traditional brick and mortar model. The adoption by consumers of technology in terms of mobile growth and so on has really transformed consumers as an empowered force. Today, consumers can know about anything they want anywhere in the world, and that flow of information and the speed with which consumers learn about different issues like sustainability, like wages, like sweatshops, like environmental degradation is really driving retailers to actually step up their game. So this is another pressure. The last one, which is not mentioned here, but which is really prevalent, is that the rise of Asia, and especially the rise of China as a consuming power, basically ties all of this together, in that Chinese consumers are far more mobile, far more e-commerce adept. By next year, 33% of all retail sales in China will actually be e-commerce sales. And so Chinese consumers, and China being the number one consumer and apparel market in the world today, I mean, it's really putting a lot of pressure on global brands to really revamp their supply chains. So as a result, what we see is huge pressures on supply chain, not only in terms of speed, but also order quantities. So you see the normal order cycle was 40 weeks. Now there's pressure to get it down to 20 weeks, 10 weeks, and 5 weeks. So Zara, actually their order cycle is 5 weeks from design to delivery. Also in terms of cost, because as supply chains, the normal way for supply chains historically over the past several decades to respond to pressures is to just add more workers, because workers used to be cheap. And if workers in China were too expensive, then they can go to Bangladesh and India and so on. Today, all of the key production countries, for especially for the apparel industry, are under the governments are under tremendous pressure to raise wages because workers are empowered, because unions are empowered, and because organizing workers is a lot easier with new technology at their disposal. So wages are rising, and basically it's getting harder and harder to move the supply chain further afield because of various issues like supply of components and so on. So factories are having to respond to both wage pressures. Meanwhile, nobody is raising prices because the brands are under pressure from consumers who now can find out, how to get a cheap good easier. And then the last one, sustainability, is that factories basically, as consumers demand more transparency and sustainability, factories have to meet those new demands without more money, without better prices, and all while their costs are rising. So that's the story of supply chains today. Now, there's a lot of experts within the industry who say that actually digitization and automation is the answer to supply chain pressures, because if you can't add workers and you can't add capital, then you have to add knowledge, which is essentially technology. This is a chart from the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, but it was actually created by a German think tank, which actually correctly lays out the roadmap for automation. So basically, when we say automation, we're not actually talking about substituting in a machine for one worker. We're talking about a process that begins with connectivity and digitization of processes in a labor-intensive environment, moves to visibility, moves through IoT and controlling your operations using technology in real time, then using data about the operations to drive efficiency, and then finally gets to using robotics and cobots to really drive efficiency on the factory floor. So why do we start with digitization, and why don't we just put a bunch of robots in the factory? Basically, factories are very basic places. The workers are generally uneducated because these are all developing countries with underdeveloped education systems. There's a lack of finance because in many emerging markets, the banking system isn't really where it should be in order to provide investment, especially to small and medium-sized enterprises. There is a low-cost mindset because all of these factories have basically been created as labor-intensive enterprises, and so and cost advantage has always won them business in the past. So basically, we have to start at the level where factories are today, and that's digitization. So now I'm going to run through a couple of ways that you can actually digitize processes. The first is basically using different tools like mobile apps to basically digitize processes that can't be substituted with robots. So this is quality. We still need to do quality inspections manually because smart cameras and AI aren't yet to the point where you can actually have a camera do the garment inspection. But what you can do is actually grab data and manipulate that data and manage the quality process in real time using digital applications. We're using a lot more sensors in factories to basically also grab data from different parts of the operations. This is a sensor network that actually measures energy efficiency in the factory, basically energy consumption of various machinery, which is a first step to using sensors to monitor production. So this is, again, a way for factory managers to basically create a digital replica of their operations so that they can actually manage by data rather than managing by the naked eye. As factories get more digital applications and get more connectivity, you actually need the workers to do more. And as workers actually get more in demand, actually you need to engage workers a lot better as potential sources of innovation and creativity and knowledge. And so we're finding that worker engagement becomes a lot more important, and we're using mobile apps to do worker training and engagement, and basically enable workers to move into the digital economy in the workplace. It's already happening in their lives. Very many production countries already have smartphone penetration of anywhere between 30 and 60%. It will happen by 2020. Every factory in a production country is probably going to be having a smartphone. So how do we use a smartphone to actually engage workers and bring them up to the level where they have relevant skills for the digital economy? And finally, there are instances where where factories can find good ways to use robots and cobots. And a lot of these are to enable them to get rid of what's called the 3Ds, the dull, dirty, and dangerous work, and have robots do them instead. Now, we've already done internal studies which shows what is intuitively obvious, that technology basically drives performance, in that factories that had implemented various digitization and automation technologies actually perform better in terms of quality and their ability to deliver on time. So what you have is a situation where factories have increased capacity, um, or the converse, which is that they can actually achieve the same capacity and production with fewer workers, which brings up the next question, which is, will technology decimate Asia's job gains? And when we say decimate, it is actually a significant number of jobs that are at stake. If you look at this chart, it just shows that over the past 3 decades, Asia has actually created 706 million jobs. And essentially, that's a lot due to global supply chains and the growth of labor-intensive manufacturing throughout key production countries in East, South, and Southeast Asia. So we really have a situation where manufacturing has really been the springboard for Asia to climb out of poverty. Um, and so as technology spreads, I mean, it's an obvious question that will manufacturing workers actually be disintermediated and lose their jobs as a result of digitization and automation? Um, Even though this process will probably take years, because we're starting with digitization, and that is already a long process, but eventually we're going to come to the question where we're going to have hundreds of million, or are we going to have hundreds of millions of workers who are out of jobs? Um, One of the suggestions on what to do about this is what China is currently doing, which is as they upgrade and technologize their manufacturing sector, there's a big push to diversify the economy in the service sector. And that may actually work for China, because in China, the service sector is basically very structured, because China has very good control over its economy relative to Southeast Asia. But in Southeast Asia, the service sector is largely informal. And the informal economy is largely unregulated, with poor health and safety and human rights protections for the workers. So it's not as easy an answer for Southeast Asia to say, okay, well, if manufacturing is going to face job loss, should we then push into services? So it's a real question on what Asian countries should do. Um, I'd like to propose that actually part of enabling change responsibly in the age of automation, deals with how preparing workers to better navigate the digital economy. And we've done research on how to better prepare workers to in a situation where their factory is undergoing digitization and automation. And we found that actually 3 things really help workers be psychologically confident and be technically prepared in this environment. The first is obviously technical training on automation. So while you won't take a factory worker, who's worked in a labor-intensive factory for 30 years, you're not going to make a digital native out of this worker, but you can equip him with the key skills that they need to become, to continue to contribute meaningfully, even as the operation becomes more digitized. So this is really about continuous learning in a given factory. The second is an open and supportive corporate culture, which is all about giving workers the confidence, the respect, and the empowerment and the opportunity to grow and upgrade their skills as the needs of the factories change. The third is innovation, in that as workers do more, and as workers have more visibility on the enterprise, you actually put them in a position to contribute more meaningfully in terms of suggesting ideas, suggesting where the factory could invest more, being digital forward, being more transparent in how decisions are made. And all of these things are going to be, they're challenging for labor intensive factories who have always treated workers as a means to an end. But now, actually, in the new digital environment, factories will need to basically treat workers as full-fledged, thinking, sentient kind of employees who can actually contribute meaningfully, even though their digital skills will always need work. So this actually, and all of these things, will both help workers who remain in factories that are automating, as well as giving them skills that they can actually export if they actually need to be transitioned out of the factory. These are all the skills that they will need in the digital economy. And so if we're thinking of how do we equip workers in Asia's current factories, then the obvious question comes up, well, what should we be doing about workers who are going to enter the workforce to enable them to compete and succeed and really navigate the digital economy? And this is where actually we come up with the education system. So Asia's education system is great at producing good PISA scores, the test of science and math, but it's less good at promoting the kind of creativity and innovation and always on attitude that is really going to matter. And so it's obvious that in the past, Asia's education really was great for labor-intensive factories because it produce workers who were very productive and very consistent at doing the same thing over and over again. Whereas tomorrow's economy is actually going to be a lot more demanding, a lot more about scalable learning, a lot more about picking things up as you go along, and about enabling workers to actually be creative and empowered. So that's pretty much it. I look forward to the discussion.
Sorry, I forgot to turn myself off mute. We have a quick clarification question from John Galani, just seeking to ask, what's a cobot?
Okay, so a cobot is a collaborative robot. It's just an abbreviation on the idea that the majority of industrial robots going into factories today are actually not sort of one-for-one replacements for workers, but rather um, uh, robots that actually help humans do their job on the assembly line. And this is where it comes in, where dull, dirty, and dangerous tasks, especially. So they're basically robots that help humans perform more efficiently.
Thanks, Pamela. We had a question from Barry Trill who was wondering, are we being idealistic when we think blue-collar markets digitizing will still provide and protect jobs? I mean, isn't it inevitable that these jobs will eventually lose out to technology in these factories?
So I think obviously the process of digitization is going to take a number of years. And this is where I think it is not being idealistic, but it's being realistic to realize that we're not going to get to fully automated factories overnight because there's so many issues which are standing before that in Asia, especially in the emerging markets. So obviously, while if you build a factory in the US or Europe today, it is going to be really automated. But what you have in Asia and what exists and drives a lot of the global supply chains are really labor intensive, very basic enterprises. And so the process of automating is actually going to go through a number of steps. And it's that process, that a number of steps, which begins with digitization and connectivity and so on, which actually gives us time to prepare the workers so that when it comes time that they actually do need to leave the global supply chains, that they're actually ready to navigate the digital economy. I don't think that's realistic at all. I think that's actually how the process of automation is going to take place in global supply chains, which are today labor intensive.
No, it's an interesting point, isn't it, Pam? Because I think people think automation is an automatic thing. And as you say, it will go through phases before you get there. So there are opportunities to adapt along the process. We had another question here from Robin Little, who says, if you look at a country like India with the population that it has, how can we ensure that people are not losing jobs and we're not adding to poverty in these countries? In other words, how can you innovate responsibly? And I wonder if there's an example you can give of the work you've done, perhaps in India, to talk about how you've approached this problem through your work.
Yeah, so in the I guess in the apparel industry, we have this idea that the apparel industry has created tons of jobs in the past 3 decades, which is a great thing. Um, Personally, I don't think it's sustainability to keep those labor-intensive workers in factories for the rest of their life. It's the natural process of advancement and economic growth is through technology upgrading. So it's totally realistic and natural that we should want these factories to actually upgrade. Now, India's got a huge youth population who do need jobs, and so obviously the manufacturing industry still can create a lot of those jobs, but we should try to create them at the level of technology which enables them to compete in the global economy. And today, with the pressures on speed, price, quality, delivery, sustainability, the only way to do that is to go through digitization and to reach the point where you can serve what's needed on the global markets. Now, in terms of the things that we are doing to help factories compete in that way, which is to digitize their operations, we create digital apps to actually speed the process of digitization in the factory to help them be more efficient. We're rolling out sensors for energy efficiency. Our mobile app for workers is going to launch in India actually next month in July, which is going to help factory managers especially make that transition from treating the workers as just means to an end to actually valuing the workers and seeking to engage them and enabling to use mobile technologies to really upgrade the skills of the workers. It's a chicken and egg. You know, you can't digitize so fast because your workers aren't trained to do that. So you actually have to train the workers while you're digitizing. And obviously, you know, this is going to take some time. But I think, you know, that time actually gives us time to cope.
John had an interesting point on that because, you know, how much of the education comes down to age aspects? You know, is it very difficult to shift older workers onto these kind of new I can't even speak now, digitized platforms?
So, I mean, it's a reality that the workers are getting mobile phones. They are using digital apps in the rest of their lives. Now, the pressure for the factory is that if the worker sees the digital economy evolving around them, even in a place like India, which is still very, very rudimentary in a lot of different in a lot of different aspects of the economy. But workers have mobile phones. They see what's happening, and if their workplace isn't automating and isn't going digital, then actually that's really worrying for them. And that's actually something we found out in our research, which involved surveying workers at all levels in one of our countries. Is that we began the research thinking, well, workers will be very worried if they're gonna their factories digitizing, that they will be out of a job. Actually, it was the converse. The workers worried that their place of employment wasn't digitizing fast enough. Okay, because they see the pace of change in society. So I think it's completely natural for us to expect, let's support factories as they digitize, and let's use the time of digitization to actually take a responsible approach and bring the workers along with us. Now, not every worker is going to be able to adapt. There will be workers who leave. So our goal is make that process responsible, make it so that the worker actually leaves the factory with some relevant skills, because they're not getting them from the education system today, and really try to help factory managers see that it's in their interest to do this kind of training.
No, that's fascinating, Pam. Rishi Sethi has a question that takes us out of Asia a little bit. But if you look at the transport and logistics industry, what do you think will be the impact of automated vehicles, especially in the Western world, for example, the US, where trucking is a major industry and employer?
So, I mean, I'm not an expert on logistics and transport in the U.S., but from what I've read and from the people that I've talked to, it is different technologies are actually helping transport companies manage their workers better, treat their workers better, sense when the worker needs to be replaced or needs a rest. And basically, the trucking industry is desperate for workers. They can't find enough employees. And actually, this is a link back to China. Some of the factories that we work with in China, their main motivation for automation is actually because they can't find workers who want to work in factories anymore. Okay, today's millennials, they don't want to get a factory job. Okay, and if they get a factory job, they don't want to stay there 20 years like their parents. So there's a real pressure for factories to see, how do I be efficient? How do I stay relevant in a world where workers are scarce or more expensive, and yet the demands from buyers are always increasing. So, I mean, I think in terms of the Chinese government's policy of forcing its manufacturers up the value chain, they've correctly sensed that this could become a social problem, and so they're really supporting manufacturers to kind of get out of labor-intensive, low-cost mentality, and that can only be a good thing.
I was struck in your presentation that Vietnam is most at risk, 70% manufacturing sector. Do you know of anything that's happening within the country to address that? Because that's such a high proportion of the workforce in sort of, going to be impacted by these automated practices. Is there learnings from China that are being replicated across the region or anything specific that's happening in Vietnam?
So I think this is the real pressure on Southeast Asia, because what's happened in China is that as factories become pressured, they actually just move out, or they expand out their production to Bangladesh or India. And you see that all over Asia, that actually a significant number of the foreign factories are actually Chinese factories, and Cambodia, Vietnam, and so on, and Korean factories and Taiwanese factories. I think the pressure for Southeast Asia is that there's no next location unless you go to Africa with a whole different set of challenges. So the challenge for Vietnamese, Cambodia, and Myanmar, and so on, is that there's no escape. Okay, there's no more low cost. So their only way to go is up. They can't add workers, they can't add hours, they can't combat, they can't push wages down further. So they have to upgrade, and that is actually a really good thing, because it's unreasonable to think that these factories should always be labor intensive, especially with global markets going the way they are. And as soon as these global supply chains start fulfilling the demand in China, that pressure to be faster, to have higher quality, to operate with lower quantities, and to be price competitive, and to be sustainable, although sustainability is less an issue for the Chinese destination market. I mean, those pressures aren't going to go away. So the question today is, how do we help factories digitize and go and automate while being responsible about the impacts on workers? And luckily, the digitization process takes a number of years. And so we have to work with factories to help them understand what is responsible automation. So,
Hello?
yes.
Sorry, I seem to have been thrown out of the system then. Automation playing its tricks on me. But I'm back again now. We're coming to the end of our time, but I wanted to quickly try and get in the last two questions that we have. So let me pose both of them to you. So first, Robin Little asks, what companies are innovating responsibly that you think are leading by example? Is there anybody out there that people can look to as an example of how corporates should be behaving? And John Krause asks, truck drivers will likely drive a convoy of digitally connected vehicles and be employed more for the start and end phases of the journeys. I'm not sure, John, if the last part of your question has come through. So maybe while you answer Robin's, we can wait for the end of your question.
So obviously it's very hard to name companies which are automating responsibly, because I would like to name my own company. Um, but you know, essentially you have large factory groups around Asia which are trying their best to train their workers. There's a very large factory group that is actually Hong Kong based, that has actually educated their workers on how to build mobile apps. These are factory workers, and you know the factory gives them education on coding. This is one great example of how we can equip. And the thing is, factories are always thinking, oh, we can train workers, but what we need to do is actually train workers on skills which aren't directly used on the floor. That is what's going to actually give them skills which are relevant outside the factory. We have to do the on-floor training as a matter of course, but we should also think what could work, what will really add to the workers' kind of personal capital. Is it English? Is it coding? Is it financial literacy training? All of these things which are going to empower workers and help them feel more confident about finding their place in an economy that is changing so fast. These are the things that factories should be looking to do.
Thank you, Pam. On that note, we've come to the end of the webinar, but I just wanted to thank you because that was absolutely fascinating to understand a bit more in depth the impact of some of these processes on supply chains and the global economy. On your screens, you'll see upcoming information on upcoming webinars. I do hope you're able to join us for that, but please join me in thanking Pamela for today and look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you.